Late afternoon in the Kalagati sands, the heat pressed down so heavily that even the horizon wavered in the distance, the air shimmering above the pale red earth as though the land itself were breathing. A dry wind skated across the dunes, shifting fine layers of dust that clung to skin, fur, and cloth, the grains catching in the creases of the eyes and lips until every movement felt slow and deliberate. The desert here was not a place that offered much in the way of second chances. It was a land that rewarded strength and punished weakness without pause, and on this particular day that truth revealed itself in the still figure lying near the shallow dip of a thorn-lined gully. It was a male lion, his body pressed so low to the earth it seemed to be part of it, the sparse mane dull with neglect, the angles of his ribs jutting sharply under the skin as if his frame had been carved down to its barest form. Each rise and fall of his chest came with a pause, a hitch in the breath and a faint rasp that carried no weight of strength behind it. Not far away, Ranger Elias slowed his vehicle to a halt, eyes narrowing in that practiced way of someone who had spent years learning to read the smallest of signs in open land. The shape could have been mistaken for an outcrop of rock at a glance, but the subtle twitch of a tail confirmed life. That tiny movement, so faint it might have been mist in the shifting air, was enough to set the tone for the rest of the day. Stepping down from the vehicle, boots pressing into the hot sand, Elias kept his gaze fixed on the lion, watching for any flicker of awareness, any sign of movement beyond reflex. The air was brittle and dry in his mouth, the heat almost tactile as it pressed in, and every sound, the soft hiss of dust sliding across the ground, the distant cry of a lone bird overhead, seemed sharper for the stillness surrounding the animal. As he drew closer, Elias could see more, the faint tremor that rippled along the lion's flank, the dull and cracked wound crusted over on his left side where flies gathered in clusters, their buzzing forming a constant low vibration in the air. The mane, once a thick and proud halo, was coarse and uneven, the color dulled to a lifeless brown. The forelegs lay slack, muscles sunken, the great shoulders hollow where power used to coil. The lion's ears gave small, half-hearted turns, and his eyes, when they opened, were clouded but not vacant, still tracking movement with sluggish precision. Out here, the signs were plain to anyone who had learnt the language of survival. The animal was on the edge. Without water, without rest, without help, the desert would finish what hunger, injury, and solitude had already begun, and there was no pride nearby to offer him cover or share in the vigilance needed through the night. This was no temporary pause in the shade. This was the slow unraveling of a life. Elias stopped several meters away, crouching low in the sand to present less of a threat. He scanned the ground for signs of a recent struggle, searching for paw marks, drag lines, or the churned soil that told of a kill or fight, but the wind had been at work here too, erasing what little story might have been written in the earth. The surface was smooth, except for the lion's shallow impression, where his weight had pressed the dust flat. The animal's head shifted fractionally toward him, the slow turn of a predator too tired to rise. A dry, almost broken sound left the lion's mouth, neither a full growl nor cough, but something in between, carrying the weight of discomfort more than defiance. Elias let his voice enter the space between them, speaking low and steady, the words themselves unimportant, but the cadence calm and consistent. "Easy, boy." The ears twitched faintly at the sound, but the body did not rise and did not coil for flight. Instead, the head settled back into the dust, and the mane's tips stirred gently in the wind. The question was not whether to intervene, but how. Every move had to be measured against the cost of stress on an already weakened body. A lion in this condition had little margin left, too much pressure, and he might spend the last of his strength trying to escape, too little action, and his life would slip away under the same slow sun that had sapped him. If he rose now and attempted to move away, the effort could accelerate his decline, his breathing already shallow and labored. If he stayed like this much longer, without hydration or shelter, Organ failure would become certain. Elias glanced back toward the vehicle where the essentials waited: hydration equipment, sedatives to allow handling without panic, and basic dressings for wounds. The sun was lowering, still high enough to hold heat, but each minute closing the gap toward the desert's rapid nightfall. In this land, darkness could be both a relief and a danger. The cool air might slow the lion's decline, but it also invited scavengers and rival predators to take interest in a weakened male. The lion's flank rose again, slower than before, and midway through the movement a soft wheeze broke the rhythm. A faint twitch passed through the toes of his front paw. More reflex than intent, the muscles firing weakly before settling again. The shadow cast by his body had already shortened and pulled closer, almost disappearing into the outline of his frame. In another hour, the sun would flatten into the horizon and the land would change its face entirely. In the cooling air, his body might give up the struggle altogether, the fragile balance of survival finally tipping. Here, there were no guarantees. This was the narrowest of thresholds. One foot in the realm of recovery, the other in the certainty of loss. And while lions were built to endure, even they had limits when the desert tightened its grip. Elias shifted his weight, the soft crunch of sand under his boot, the only sound between them now. His mind was already arranging the sequence: approach with slow, non-direct movement, assess the wound visually, begin hydration in small controlled amounts, and consider sedative use if he showed signs of distress. But each of these decisions would have to bend to the lion's reaction. The stakes were clear: act with respect to his condition, or risk pushing him past the point of return. He had seen other rescues fail for less. Looking once more at the rise and fall of the great chest, Elias measured his next move carefully. The urgency was there, but so was the need for patience. In the desert, rushing could be as dangerous as doing nothing at all. The balance would have to be struck in the next few minutes, with the heat still on the land and the light already slipping away. Turning toward the vehicle, Elias kept his steps steady, resisting the urge to hurry, knowing that even the sound of a fast approach could drain what little calm the lion had left. The air between them felt weighted now. Not only with the heat, but also with the knowledge that every choice from this moment forward could mean the difference between the lion walking again or the desert claiming him before the stars rose. In this vast and empty place, where survival was an unbroken test of endurance, that was the only truth that mattered. Elias moved in from the side, his boots pressing softly into the loose sand, each step measured and deliberate, his path curved to avoid the directness of a predator's challenge. The air was dry and faintly metallic with the scent of dust that had been turned over by the day's wind, and ahead of him the lion's body remained low and unmoving, a pale, tawny shape pressed into the earth as though weight alone had anchored it there. The rise and fall of the chest was so faint it might have gone unnoticed if not for the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading such signs. But here it was, long intervals between each lift, a drawn-out exhale carrying a rasp that spoke of strain. Then, as the wind shifted, the left ear moved in a weak, uncoordinated flick, the kind of reflex that was almost involuntary. Elias's gaze traced the line of the animal's flank until it found the crusted wound, dark, hardened edges framing a patch where the fur was matted and clumped from dried blood. The wound had been left long enough for flies to claim it, their persistent movement forming a blackened halo that pulsed and scattered in restless patterns as they landed, fed, and lifted again. Each contact drew a small, uneven ripple from the muscle beneath, the twitch less a deliberate rejection than the body's minimal resistance to irritation. It was not an open bleed, no fresh red to signal urgency of that kind, but the danger was not in blood loss now. Left untreated, infection could spread quietly, and in a body already deprived of water and energy, such an infection would not need long to tip the balance toward collapse. Elias crouched low in the sand, keeping his outline smaller, his weight distributed to reduce sudden noise. His eyes moved over the lion's form with methodical care, noting details that told the story of his decline. The paws, though intact, were dry and stiff-looking, the pads showing the dullness of wear without the clean edges of an active hunter. The tail lay limp behind him, its tuft catching lightly in the occasional breeze. The mane on his right side shifted faintly with breath, but the rhythm was inconsistent. Some longer draws broken by shorter, sharper pulls, each one working harder than the last. The eyes remained half-lidded, their whites dull in the muted light, but when Elias shifted position, there was the faintest lagging movement of pupils trying to follow. It was a sign that the mind inside was not gone, but the body around it was working on the last of its reserves. The absence of any show of teeth or low-warning rumble was not acceptance, not trust. It was depletion. A healthy lion would have risen at his approach, or at least rolled to a position of readiness. This one stayed as he was, conserving energy in the only way left to him: stillness. If he stood now, it might take all he had to manage a few paces before the legs failed. If he stayed in place through the night, the cool desert air could steal what fragile warmth his system was holding, and the combination of cold stress and existing weakness might finish the work that injury and isolation had begun. From where he knelt, Elias studied the ridge of the spine, each vertebra standing out under the fur, the valleys between them telling of muscle wasted over weeks without adequate food. Hunting alone here was almost a sentence in itself. The desert did not forgive solitary predators, and without the coordinated strength of a pride, the chances of bringing down large prey were slim. The wound could have been earned in a clash over territory, or from the desperate chase of a hunt gone wrong. Either way, it had left him compromised, and in these conditions, compromise often meant defeat. Elias let his hand drop slowly toward the ground, fingers sifting through the hot sand until it slipped in a narrow stream back to the earth. The motion drew the lion's eyes for a heartbeat, enough to confirm awareness. It was minimal, but to Elias it was significant. He let his voice fill the short space between them, speaking low, steady, and without demand. "You're all right." The words carried no expectation of comprehension. The value was in the consistency of tone, the unbroken rhythm of something that was neither threat nor challenge. The choice forming in his mind was not whether to help, but when and how. There was the option to remain for a longer observation, to call for a second ranger with additional equipment, or perhaps to establish a perimeter that would allow a controlled approach. But each minute that passed allowed dehydration to deepen and heat stress to continue its quiet work. Acting now carried the chance to reverse the slide, but also the risk of startling him into movement. And in his current condition, a flight response could be fatal. Elias measured both sides against what he saw before him. The stakes were plain and could not be softened. Delay too long, and the lion might die without intervention. Push too soon, and the stress could kill him before help was of any use. Shifting slightly, Elias rose with deliberate calm, his body language open and unhurried, angling away from the lion rather than directly toward him. He began the slow arc back toward the vehicle, ensuring his movements stayed in the animal's line of sight. Behind him, the lion's head lifted fractionally to track the change, but the motion faded almost as quickly, the chin lowering again until it touched the ground. Elias noted the faint flare of the nostrils as the breeze brought with it new scents, possibly the trace of water containers, antiseptic, or the faint chemical note of sedation supplies stored in the rescue kit. The sun had shifted lower, drawing the light into a warmer gold that smoothed over the land. But it was a reminder that daylight was shortening. With the drop in temperature would come another layer of strain. In an animal whose system was already under siege, the shock of rapid cooling could be the final weight that pushed him past recovery. Elias reached the vehicle, the muted click of the compartment latch sounding loud in the stillness. The kit inside held the first essentials: hydration packs, a measured sedative for safe handling, and basic wound care supplies. The decision point had arrived. This would no longer be quiet watchfulness, but intervention. He glanced once more over his shoulder. The lion's breathing was still shallow and still uneven, and the line of his body still bore the same slackness. The flies continued their slow, circling persistence at the wound, each landing a reminder of how quickly neglect could turn fatal. The sun was still above the horizon, but the hour was narrowing. He could not postpone the next move. Every detail, from the faint twitch of an ear to the shifting gold of the light, told him the same thing. The line between survival and loss was already thin, and in this place such lines could vanish in the space of a single breath. The kit lay open on the sand, its contents arranged in the same precise order they always used in the field. Elias's hands moved without wasted motion, assembling the darting equipment. The small vial of sedative held steady to avoid spilling a fraction more than intended. The dose had been calculated for the lion's weight and weakened state, enough to bring him into manageable stillness without overburdening a system already struggling. Around him, the air felt sharper, the sun lower, and the knowledge pressed in that every minute left unspent on action was another minute closer to organ failure. The lion had not shifted position since they had first approached, but his breathing had grown more irregular, the pauses between inhalation and exhalation stretching just a little longer than before. If they forced him to move or startled him into running, his body might not recover from the exertion. If they waited too long, the steady decline would slip beyond reversal. The line between these two risks was narrow and shifting, and each step they took now had to walk it without faltering. Elias signaled to Mara, the veterinary officer, to position herself at a low angle off to the lion's right, where the approach would be less direct. The tranquilizer rifle was cradled against her shoulder, her breathing measured to keep the sight line steady. The lion's ear flicked once at a faint sound behind him, but he did not rise. His eyes, half closed against the lowering light, shifted faintly toward movement in the periphery. Dust lifted in soft swirls around his forepaws, catching against the darkened edges of the wound at his flank. The flies shifted in a restless cloud as the breeze stirred, only to return in their persistent orbit. Mara waited for the subtle turn of the head that would angle muscle over bone, giving the dart a clean line without striking too close to the injury. Elias stayed in view but kept his posture open and non-threatening, a fixed point in the lion's awareness to prevent surprise from an unseen movement. The muted crack of the dart release was almost lost in the open air, but the lion's head rose a fraction at the impact, a muscle flinching beneath the skin before settling again. His tail twitched, then stilled. Elias counted the seconds, watching for the slow sag of the shoulders, the lowering of the head. The sedative's onset would not be instant, and in these moments a startled flight was still possible. "Easy now," he murmured, the sound carrying no demand, only rhythm. The lion blinked once, the motion heavy, and then his chin returned to the dust. His breathing stayed shallow, but the muscles in his forelegs softened, pressing more weight into the ground. At this point, movement from the team had to be both quick and quiet, closing the distance while the sedative worked through the system without tipping it too far toward collapse. Elias knelt first, placing himself where the lion could still see him if the eyes opened again. Mara checked the breathing with a quick count, her fingers light against the ribcage. The rate was slow but steady, a good sign under the circumstances. They had only minutes before the sedative would begin to wane. This was the window for assessment and basic treatment. The wound at the flank was worse at close view. Edges cracked, some tissue dry and pale, a sign that healing had stalled. Infection was not yet overwhelming the site, but without cleaning, it would spread. Elias began flushing the wound with antiseptic, each pass sending the flies lifting only to hover nearby. The lion's body shifted slightly under his touch, but there was no strength behind the movement. Water was brought forward next, administered in small measured amounts along the side of the mouth, letting it pool so he could swallow without strain. His tongue flicked once against the moisture, the swallow visible in the line of his throat. Every action was done with the awareness that their presence, even in care, added stress. His energy was a finite reserve. Every twitch of muscle, every swallow, every reaction was drawn from the same dwindling store. Elias worked methodically, rinsing debris from the wound, applying a light dressing to keep further contamination out, then retreating a step to give space. Mara monitored the breathing again, noting that it remained within a safe range. Already the light was beginning to shift into deeper gold, the shadows longer across the sand. They would need to withdraw before the sedative wore off fully, allowing him to regain awareness without panic. The final measure was leaving behind a shallow basin of water just far enough for him to find without strain, the scent strong enough to draw him toward it. As they stepped back in unison, putting distance between themselves and the lion's resting form, Elias kept his eyes on the slow, deliberate rhythm of the breaths. The treatment had been as much about preserving what strength he had left as it was about addressing the immediate injuries. If they had moved slower, infection and dehydration could have claimed him within a day. If they had moved faster, the shock could have done the same. This balance, frail, exact, and unforgiving, was what held his survival now. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of dust over the open land, and Elias knew they had done all they could in this moment. The rest would depend on whether the desert would give him the time to recover. The stillness began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. A faint tightening of muscle along the lion's shoulders, a slow lift of his head as if the weight of it alone was a test. The sedative's hold was loosening, and with it came the uncertain edge between rest and strain. His eyes opened fully for the first time since they had approached, the pupils narrowing against the gold light spilling low across the sand. Elias kept his position several meters away, body turned slightly to avoid any suggestion of challenge, watching for signs that the lion might panic or lunge too soon. The big male drew in a breath, then pushed against the earth with his forelegs, his elbows trembling before they locked part way. The motion stalled, his head lowering again, chest rising quickly from the effort. Every attempt now was burning energy his body could not afford to waste, but staying down much longer would leave him vulnerable to the desert's predators when darkness fell. The choice was his, but the cost was plain. If he forced too much strength into his limbs now, the shock to his weakened muscles and heart could undo the rescue entirely. A shallow container of water, its scent carried easily on the air, was placed a few paces from where his head rested. The sound of it, settling into the sand, drew a faint flick of his ears, then a shift in his gaze. His nostrils flared once, catching the trace of moisture. Slowly, with pauses between movements, he tried again, front paws digging slightly for grip, haunches lifting with a visible sway that ran through his spine. His tail flicked once in balance before he leaned forward, the steps toward the container small and halting. The muscles in his shoulders shivered under the strain, and his head dropped low, not from aggression but to brace his weight. His breath came heavier now, each exhale puffing small clouds of dust into the cooling air. Elias's eyes followed every motion, ready to retreat further if the lion's instability tipped toward collapse. The water was only a few strides away, but in his condition, each one was its own trial. When he reached it, he lowered his head with care, as if even bending his neck needed calculation. His tongue extended to lap slowly at the surface, pulling in small mouthfuls that disappeared almost as soon as they touched his throat. He paused between each sip, breathing through his nose, eyes half closing as he waited for his body to catch up with the act of drinking. The pauses were not hesitation, they were necessity. Too much at once could choke him, and the conservation of strength was as important as the hydration itself. The container's surface rippled with each movement, small rings spreading outward and fading into stillness before the next. Elias counted them quietly in his head, noting the steadiness of the rhythm, the absence of frantic gulping that could have signaled deeper distress. The lion drank until the surface was nearly still again, his head lifting slightly, water clinging to the fur along his chin before dropping into the sand. His breathing steadied marginally, though the tremors in his legs did not ease. Standing for long was clearly beyond him, so he folded down into a crouched rest, positioning himself so his forelegs were tucked and his hindquarters supported. The container sat just within reach, its presence a lifeline should he find the strength for another drink before night fully settled. The light had softened now, edges of shadow stretching long across the ground, the gold deepening into a muted amber. This was the fragile in-between, where the day's heat eased but the night's cold had not yet bitten down. It was a reprieve, but a short one. If his body could stabilize through these next hours, he might stand again with the dawn. If it failed him, the desert would not wait. Elias stepped back further, giving the lion the full space of the cooling sand. The rescue had reached its most uncertain stage, not the urgency of treatment, but the quiet test that followed it, where the animal's own strength would decide the outcome. The wind moved low across the ground, stirring dust that swirled briefly around the lion's paws before slipping away into the growing dusk. In that fading light, the big male's chest rose and fell with slow persistence, each breath marking time in the narrowing distance between danger and survival. Said, the lion stayed in a low crouch for a long while, his head lifting only now and then to scent the air, the muscles in his shoulders still shivering from the strain of standing earlier. The shallow basin of water remained close, its surface broken occasionally by slow, deliberate laps, each one followed by a pause as if to gauge the effort it cost. His breathing was steadier than it had been, but it was far from strong, the long inhales still edged with the faint rasp of fatigue. Elias kept his distance, crouched in the cooling sand, measuring every small change with the same quiet attention he had given since the rescue began. The light was slipping further toward the horizon now, the sky thinning into a washed amber that promised the coming chill. That shift in air brought more than just temperature, it carried scent farther, and in the stillness between the wind's breaths, another presence began to take shape. On the far edge of the land, moving against the faint shimmer of heat still lifting from the ground, several low silhouettes appeared. At first they were only shapes, steady and unhurried in their approach, the kind of movement that belonged to animals familiar with the territory. Elias lifted his binoculars briefly, confirming the unmistakable outline of lions, 3, possibly 4, advancing at a pace that spoke of deliberate curiosity rather than flight or pursuit. It was impossible to tell yet if they were rivals or kin. The scent of an injured male could draw both. The lion in the foreground seemed to sense them before sight confirmed it, his head lifted fully now, nostrils widening, eyes narrowing into the low light. His ears shifted forward, then flicked back once, and the faint line of his tail twitched along the sand. Every muscle along his back stiffened slightly, and Elias could see the calculation in his body language, not thought but instinct measuring whether to brace, retreat, or stay motionless. In his current condition, any physical confrontation could undo all of the work done in the last hours. If these newcomers were challengers, his survival odds would shrink instantly. The approaching lions closed the distance in a loose line, their outlines separating as they adjusted to the lay of the land. One veering slightly left, another falling back. There was no sign of a charge, no accelerated gait, no lowered heads, but their presence alone was enough to change the balance of the moment. Elias felt the weight of the risk settle sharply. If these were strangers, his injured male would not have the strength to defend himself, and human interference in a lion-to-lion conflict was impossible without escalating danger to all involved. The water basin, the wound care, even the sedation earlier, all of it could be rendered meaningless in minutes. Yet if they were members of his pride, this could mean the difference between recovery in solitude and recovery under the protection of a group. The lion eased himself from the crouch into a standing position, unsteady but unwilling to remain low with others in sight. His tail flicked again, and he took 2 slow steps forward. The the tremor in his legs clear but controlled. The air between him and the approaching group seemed to hold, the fading sun washing their shapes into bronze silhouettes. Elias and Mara remained still, their attention fixed on the exchange of body language. Ears forward, tails lowered, no overt displays of threat yet. The leading female stopped first, head tilted slightly, her gaze locked on the male. The others fanned out in a loose semicircle behind her, their movements measured, not pressing forward too quickly. The wind shifted once more, carrying their scent across the open ground, and the injured lion's posture changed subtly, still tense, but less rigid. His head dipped a fraction, not in submission but in a gesture that suggested recognition. For a moment, nothing else moved. The horizon behind them had darkened to a thin band of deepening gold, the air cooler now, carrying the faint rustle of grass where the wind touched it. Elias kept his eyes on the space between the lions, knowing that the next few minutes would decide whether the rescue continued into safety or shifted toward an unavoidable end. The shapes at the edge of the light remained steady, their outlines softening in the approaching dusk, and the land itself seemed to wait with them. Said, the figures on the horizon moved with deliberate slowness, the low light flattening their shapes until they emerged as distinct forms against the cooling earth. The leading female kept her head level, ears forward but relaxed, and her tail hanging low in a posture that neither invited nor rejected contact. The others followed at staggered distances, pausing every few steps to assess, their movements precise and unhurried. The injured male watched without shifting his weight, his chest rising in slow, deep breaths that seemed to steady as the moments passed. The set of his shoulders remained tense, but there was no flicker of aggression in his stance, no forward thrust of the head, no raised tail. He stood as though waiting for confirmation of what his senses were already telling him. The air carried their scent now, clearer with every shift of the wind, and though Elias could not interpret the full exchange, he could read the absence of immediate danger in the stillness of both sides. The younger female broke formation first, stepping from behind the lead lioness in a movement so fluid it seemed almost instinctive. Her head lowered slightly, eyes fixed on the male, her tail making a slow arc behind her. She closed the distance in a line of quiet confidence, pausing only once to glance back at the others. The male's posture altered in response, not softening entirely, but adjusting just enough that his weight settled more evenly across his front paws, his ears angled toward her, his gaze following her every step. When she stopped within reach, there was a pause long enough for the breeze to pass between them, stirring the dust at their feet. Then she leaned forward and touched her nose lightly to his. The contact was brief, but it held the weight of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that bridged the space between separation and belonging. Elias noted the change immediately, the shift in the male's stance, the slight lowering of his head after the touch. The tension that had held him upright seemed to ease, his tail giving a single slow flick as the female stepped to his side. One of the other lions began to circle closer, keeping a wide berth before settling a few paces away. There was no growl, no posturing. Instead, the group arranged themselves in loose proximity, their bodies angled in ways that left the male an open path to move or rest as he chose. It was a pattern Elias had seen before in prides reuniting, a balance between caution and acceptance, the collective instinct to read the returning member's condition before making any claim. The male took a step forward, closing the gap between himself and the younger female, his movement slow but steady. She matched his pace for 2 strides before falling into step beside him, her head dipping briefly toward his shoulder in a subtle, guiding gesture. The others followed in a widening arc, creating a loose shield of presence around them. Elias watched from his distance, aware that this development might mean the difference between survival and decline. Alone. The injured lion's recovery would have been uncertain at best. With the group's protection, his chances rose sharply. Even without the strength to hunt, The Pride could provide security against scavengers and rivals until he regained some of his former power. As the last light thinned into evening, the lions moved together toward a shallow rise in the land, their pace unhurried but purposeful. The injured male walked at the center of the loose formation, his head held low yet stable, his steps deliberate. The younger female stayed close to his side, occasionally brushing against him in quiet contact. From where Elias stood, the scene carried no grand display, only the understated certainty of animals resuming a bond that had been interrupted. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint rustle of their movement across the open ground, and the sky deepened to the muted colors of early night. In that quiet, the image fixed itself, the returning male flanked by his own kind, the open land holding them in its fading light. The Pride had closed in around the injured male, not in a tight press of bodies but in a deliberate ring that moved with him, adjusting as he shifted his weight from one step to the next. The younger female stayed closest, her flank brushing his lightly now and again, a point of steady contact that seemed to guide his slow pace. Two larger females positioned themselves at the rear, their heads turning at intervals to scan the open plain, ears pricking at distant sounds carried on the wind. A younger male lingered off to one side, far enough not to provoke but close enough to be counted as part of the circle. The injured lion's head remained low, the line of his spine tilted slightly with each step, but he was moving without faltering, and in his condition, that alone marked a shift from survival as a question to survival as a possibility. The group's formation was more than habit. It was protection, a living barrier that would intercept threat before it reached him. Alone, a weakened lion was vulnerable. Here he was once again part of a structure built for endurance. Elias and Mara stood at a distance, watching the slow arc of movement as the Pride guided the male toward a rise that would give them a view of the surrounding ground. The Rangers knew there was nothing more to be done without disrupting the natural order now reasserting itself. Water and care had bought him the time to reach this point, but from here forward, his fate lay in the rhythms of the Pride, when they chose to rest, when they moved on, when they hunted. Interference would break the trust built in those earlier hours, so they stayed still, the wind tugging faintly at their clothes as the last warmth of the day faded. The desert air was cooling quickly, the heat of the sand leaching upward in soft waves before it bled into the gathering dusk. Every few moments, the male would pause, his head turning slightly as if to keep count of those around him. Each time, one of the others would shift a step closer, reaffirming the silent boundary that held him inside their care. The light over the land deepened to bronze, the long shadows of the lion stretching across the ground until they merged into one another. The Pride reached the crest of the rise and settled there in a loose grouping, the injured male lowering himself carefully into the sand. His body moved stiffly, but he did not collapse. Instead, he folded into the ground with a measured slowness that suggested control, however limited. The younger female lay beside him, her head turning just enough that their whiskers touched. Around them, the rest of the Pride arranged themselves outward, facing the open expanse with the awareness of animals whose survival depends on what they hear and smell before they see. The formation was not absolute, but it was enough, a perimeter of muscle and vigilance that shifted with the air. From where they stood, Elias could still see the slow rise and fall of the male's chest. That steady rhythm was the most important measure now, each breath marking another moment won against the odds that had stacked against him since the day began. The Rangers exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement that their role was finished here. To move closer would risk unsettling the fragile state the male had reached. To stay longer might turn their presence into a distraction. The desert's night was not far off, and the Pride would need to settle without the disruption of human scent lingering nearby. Quietly, they began to step back, their retreat paced to avoid drawing attention away from the group's cohesion. The sun's edge had dropped low enough that it seemed to rest against the far horizon, the sky thinning into muted layers of orange and fading blue. A thin wind crossed the rise, flattening the sparse grass in soft waves, carrying with it the faintest rustle of movement as the lions shifted in the cooling air. From the distance they appeared as a single shape against the darkening land, joined not by urgency now, but by the steady, enduring weight of presence. The rescuers turned away as the last light touched the sand, leaving the lion in the company of those who would see him through the hours ahead. The crest of the rise held the pride in stillness for a time, the injured male resting among them as the warmth bled from the sand beneath his body. The air had cooled enough that each exhale lingered in faint wisps before dissolving, and the sky above had begun to lose its color, deepening into the first shadows of night. The younger female stayed close, her flank just touching his, the line of her body angled slightly toward his own as though to brace him should he shift. When he finally pushed himself up from the ground, the movement was slow but deliberate, each limb placed with care. The others adjusted around him, their formation subtly tightening so that he was never without a lion to his side. This was not haste, but a measured progression, the kind of movement that matched the rhythm of survival in a landscape where energy was spent only when it had to be. For the male, each step was both a test and a reclamation, the act of moving forward a statement that he could still keep pace, however slowly. The pride began to descend from the rise, their paws pressing into the softening sand, leaving tracks that the night wind would soon erase. The injured male walked at the center, his head carried low, eyes fixed on the land ahead, ears turning to catch the quiet exchanges of sound between the others. The younger female's tail flicked now and again, brushing lightly against his leg, a brief signal of proximity. The two larger females took position slightly ahead, their heads lifting to scan the plain as the fading light made the horizon more difficult to read. The younger male kept to the rear, his presence completing the moving boundary that sheltered the one they had reclaimed. Elias and Mara stood at a distance, watching their progress without moving to follow. To do so would be to intrude on the cohesion the pride had formed around him. Their part had ended here, replaced by the unspoken agreement between the lions themselves. The male's gait was steady now, no longer halting but still careful, each step placed to avoid unnecessary strain. His breathing, though heavier than the others, no longer carried the same rasping edge it had earlier in the day. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of dry grass from a low plain beyond, and the pride adjusted their course toward it. The land ahead offered the kind of cover and vantage they would need to pass the night. Elias kept his eyes on the slow sway of their movement, noting how the group never let the distance between them widen. Here, his survival was no longer about medical intervention or measured doses of water. It rested entirely on the protective instinct of those around him. Without them, his vulnerability would once again become a liability in the open desert. With them, he stood a chance to recover enough to reclaim his role within their structure. The last edge of the sun cast a long, coppery glow across the sand, the pride's shadows stretching far ahead as if marking the path they would take. The male moved without faltering as they crossed into the darker band of land where the light no longer reached. The rhythm of their paws was muted against the cooling earth, their silhouettes growing softer until the distinctions between them blurred into a single, shifting shape. The horizon swallowed them in the slow way dusk does, first erasing detail, then form, until only the memory of movement remained against the deepening sky. Elias and Mara turned back toward their vehicle, the cooling wind brushing past them with the faint scent of the pride still lingering. They left knowing they had witnessed more than the survival of a single lion. In the quiet retreat of the day into night, they had seen his return to a place where strength was shared and where, for now, he belonged again.